The wind did not blow through the Kara Valley, it drove through it like something with a grievance older than the mountains themselves. It came off the northern faces in long horizontal sheets, carrying ice crystals that moved at 60 kilometers per hour and struck exposed skin like fine-grade sandpaper. Temperature at the valley floor, -23 Celsius. At the ridgeline, with wind chill factored, the number became academic. It was simply the kind of cold that the body understands not as a measurement, but as a warning. A convoy of 7 armored vehicles crawled through the white dark in a slow procession, their headlights swallowed within 30 feet of their sources. The lead truck's wipers had iced over at the hinges an hour ago. The driver leaned forward until his nose nearly touched the windshield glass, trying to locate the road's edge by the texture of the snow packed and firm over asphalt, soft and giving on the shoulder drop. One mistake would put the vehicle over the edge into a ravine that nobody would find before the thaw. Above the convoy, pressed flat against a ledge of limestone and hard-packed ice, a woman lay absolutely still. She had been still for 2 hours. The cold had moved past pain long ago and settled into a deeper register, a conversation between her body and the mountain, a negotiation that she was conducting with the calm of long practice. Her outer layer was white. Her inner layers were damp with the sweat of the 2-hour climb. She did not shiver. Shivering meant movement. And movement, at this range, from a thermal-equipped unit in the valley below, meant detection. The rifle lay across its bipod in the packed snow at the ledge's edge. It was not a modern rifle. Anybody who understood weapons would have seen that at a glance, the long walnut stock worn smooth at the grip and cheekpiece from years of use, the iron sights scuffed and reblued twice, the bolt handle curved back at the end like a question mark. The barrel showed the small, careful impressions of a machinist's modification at the crown. The scope was the only modern element, fitted to an aftermarket rail with the precision of something that had been done and redone until it was exactly right. But the rifle beneath the scope was old. Old in the way that certain things are old, not decayed, but seasoned, the way wood and metal become when they have been used enough and cared for enough that use and care become indistinguishable from each other. Colonel Nathan Briggs had seen the rifle 4 hours earlier in the gear check bay at Forward Operating Base Ridgeline, and had said what he said with the full weight of his authority and his certainty behind it. "A Woodstock bolt action," he had said. "You brought a Woodstock bolt action to a live convoy protection operation in a Category 3 weather event in the Kara Mountain sector." She had not replied. Now, on the ridge, she made a quarter-turn adjustment to the bipod's left leg and put her eye to the scope. The radio on her hip crackled. A voice, Lieutenant Caldwell's, constrained and tight, said the words she had been positioned to hear. "Contact. Vehicle formation. 12 o'clock. 5 vehicles. Moving to block." She exhaled slowly. The first shot would come in 40 seconds. The colonel, in the lead vehicle 2 kilometers south, would not laugh again. 14 hours earlier, Forward Operating Base, Ridgeline, Kara Mountain Sector. The briefing room at Forward Operating Base Ridgeline was a converted equipment bay that had been walled off with temporary partition panels and heated by 3 ceramic space heaters running at maximum capacity, which, together, raised the temperature to approximately 8 degrees Celsius. This was considered acceptable. The coffee was hot. The maps were current. That was enough. 12 soldiers arranged themselves around a folding table, whose surface was covered in laminated topographic maps, weighted at the corners with ammunition canisters. Some sat, most stood. Standing was warmer, and the chairs were inadequate to the gear. Everyone was wearing body armor, cold weather base layers, radio harnesses. The room smelled of wet nylon, machine oil, burned coffee, and the particular variety of collective tension that precedes operations nobody is entirely confident will go as planned. Colonel Nathan Briggs stood at the head of the table with the composed authority of a man for whom this situation was the natural habitat. He was 51 years old, built economically not large, but with nothing wasted and possessed of a jaw that appeared structural rather than decorative, and eyes the pale, flat gray of winter sky over open tundra. He had served in 4 operational theaters across a career that had begun when half the soldiers in this room were in elementary school. He had never lost a convoy under his command. He intended to maintain that record with the focused determination of someone who understands that maintained records require active work, not passive expectation. "Pay attention," he said, and the room went quiet with the speed that rooms go quiet for people who have earned it. The Convoy carries encrypted relay hardware and prototype targeting components. The total value classified at a tier above this briefing. The strategic value high enough that Command has authorized the operation during a Category 3 weather event, which tells you everything you need to know about how seriously they want this cargo at Firebase Langton. He tapped the map at the Valley transit route. "We depart in 90 minutes. The window for the Valley crossing closes when the second front arrives. Current forecast puts that at 6 hours from now. We have 4 hours of usable transit time. We will use all 4. He looked around the room, reading faces the way he had always read faces for information, not reassurance. Sergeant First Class Donald Hewitt spoke from the corner. He was the senior NCO on the operation, 22 years in, with the economical bearing of someone who had been shot at enough times that wasted motion had come to feel physically unpleasant. ROE for Mountain Sector Contact? Minimum engagement. The cargo moves through. We do not stop to fight unless there is no alternative. Briggs paused. Which is why we have a specialist attached. He nodded toward the doorway. Nobody had noticed the woman come in. She was standing near the back wall with a duffel bag in one hand and a rifle in the other, and she had clearly been there for some time, long enough that the lack of attention she had received had been operational rather than accidental. The room, registering her belatedly, adjusted with the small collective shift of people recalibrating what they thought they knew about a space. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, with the kind of face that had been exposed to enough weather and sustained concentration that age sat differently in it than it did in indoor faces. Dark hair, pulled back. Eyes that moved around the room with the quiet, methodical attention of someone who was, even in a rest moment, measuring angles and distances without making an event of it. Private Tyler Marsh, 23 years old and 4 months into his first deployment, leaned toward Corporal James Whitfield beside him and said, very quietly, "Who is she?" "Specialist. Attached from Command. That's everything I've got." "What does she do?" Whitfield looked at the rifle she was holding. "I think that's probably the answer." Briggs said, "She'll take an elevated position above the valley choke point and provide overwatch. Long-range interdiction if we're stopped." He did not introduce her by name, which was notable and noticed. "She travels separately, reaches position before we enter the valley. Any questions about that element?" That was when she set the rifle down on the edge of the gear table to adjust her pack strap, and Briggs saw it clearly for the first time. He looked at it. He looked at it for long enough that people near him noticed him looking. Then he said, "What is that weapon?" "A rifle, sir." His tone developed an edge. "I can see it's a rifle." "What model?" Mosin Nagant 1891/30. Soviet production, 1940 batch. Custom barrel work at the crown, reconditioned trigger group, aftermarket scope rail. The stock is original." "The stock is original," Briggs repeated. He said it the way a person repeats something to confirm they heard it correctly before responding to how absurd it is. "You mean the wooden stock?" "Yes, sir. We have a Mark 21 precision sniper rifle in the armory. Modern platform, tested to -30. I can have it in your hands in under 5 minutes." She looked at the MK-21 he was gesturing toward, then back at her own rifle. "I appreciate that, sir. But you're keeping the antique." "I'm keeping the antique." There was a sound near the door that had the ambiguous qualities of a suppressed laugh. Briggs's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in the expression of a man registering a professional judgment he finds difficult to keep to himself. "Your prerogative," he said. "I just hope the history lesson doesn't get anyone killed." She picked up the rifle and walked to the window to study the mountain. She did not respond. There was nothing useful to say, and she had learned, over time, that the most efficient response to that category of remark was to let it exist without argument, because argument only extended it. She would show him, or she would not show him. And either way, the mountain did not care what anybody thought about her rifle. 90 minutes before departure vehicle bay. The soldiers prepped in the vehicle bay in the organized chaos of mission preparation, the weapons checks and radio tests, the quiet inventorying of trauma kits that everyone does with full concentration even when they half believe they won't need them. The particular focused silence of people who are about to go somewhere dangerous and are using activity to keep the anticipation from becoming something larger than it should be. Corporal James Whitfield found her near the equipment lockers, running a bore snake through the barrel of the old rifle with the slow, deliberate attention of someone performing a ritual they have performed enough times that the ritual has become devotion. He watched her for a moment before speaking. "I hope this doesn't come across wrong," he said, "but I've never actually seen that model outside of a historical display. Does it handle cold well?" She held the barrel toward the overhead light, rotating it slowly, checking the bore from both ends. It was designed for cold. Soviet production. 1,940. Half the rifles at Stalingrad were this model, operating at -20, -30, inside frozen machine positions where modern tolerance weapons would have seized. She lowered the barrel and began reattaching the scope assembly. The mechanism is simple enough that there's very little to fail. Precision modern rifles are built to tolerances measured in hundredths of a millimeter. When those tolerances ice up, the rifle fails. This one, she worked the bolt twice. Smooth and easy, has tolerances measured in what actually works under field conditions. Whitfield turned this over. And at range? Honestly, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the map of the valley on the wall opposite. The custom barrel work puts it inside 1 MOA at 800 meters under standard conditions. I've had consistent first-round accuracy at 1,200 inches field conditions. In weather like tonight, she looked at the frosted window. There are additional variables, but those variables apply to every rifle. The question is whether you can read them. The rifle doesn't change. The shooter has to. Whitfield said nothing to that. It had the quality of something that didn't invite a response. Colonel Briggs appeared at the end of the row, dressed for the operation. He looked at the woman and the rifle with an expression that had not materially softened from the briefing room. He had a practical mind, and he held his assessments until he had reason to revise them. "Intelligence update before we depart," he said. "Signals intercepts from the last 2 hours indicate a possible hostile mechanized element in the valley sector. Possibly light armor 3 to 5 vehicles. Possibly a blocking force." He paused. "Given that, I want to ask you directly, are you confident in that weapon's effectiveness against a hardened target?" She looked up from the scope check. "Define hardened target." "Armored vehicle, standard IFV class protection. The rifle won't penetrate the armor." Briggs's expression confirmed that this was what he had expected. "But I don't need to penetrate the armor," she said. "I need to stop the vehicle. Those are different problems." She ran her thumb along the bolt. "Every vehicle has a driver. Every driver has a viewport. Every turret has a sight aperture. The question is whether I can reach those points at the ranges involved." A silence. "Can you?" "I can reach things at the ranges involved that most people don't know can be reached." Briggs looked at her steadily. She looked back at him with the same steady patience she had used in the briefing room. He was a man accustomed to having people confirm or deny things directly, and she was answering him directly, just not in the way he was most comfortable with. "One other thing," he said. "Your name isn't in my operational file. Command sent you, but sent nothing else." "That's standard, sir." "Standard for what, exactly?" She stood, slung the rifle, and picked up her pack. "For the work I do." She looked at him once more, direct, neither warm nor cold. "I'll be in position before you enter the valley. You won't see me. That's also standard." She walked out into the dark. Briggs stood for a moment where she had been standing. The gear room held the residue of her presence, the faint industrial smell of bore solvent, the slightly disturbed surface of the equipment table where the rifle had rested, the cold air that had come in when she opened and closed the door to the exterior. He looked at these things without quite looking at them, the way a person catalogs a space after someone unexpected has moved through it. Captain Dana Whitmore, the intelligence officer, came to stand beside him. She was 38 years old and had spent 6 years in tactical intelligence before moving to field support, and she had developed, over that time, a careful instinct for the space between what people said and what was actually happening. She looked at the table where the rifle had been laid, then at the door, then at Briggs. She said, quietly, "She's either exactly what she says she is, or this is a very unusual kind of problem. She's not a problem, Briggs said. He was still looking at the door. I'm not sure what she is yet. Whitmore considered the empty table. Do you want me to run her details through the secondary channel? Before we depart? No. Briggs picked up his radio harness from the bench. We have 90 minutes and a mountain to cross. We'll find out what she is by what she does. He paused. That's always been the most accurate method. He walked out toward the vehicles. Whitmore remained for a moment longer, looking at the space the woman had occupied, and thought about rifles and the people who carried them, and the distance between a thing's appearance and its history. Then she followed. The Cara Valley Transit Hour. 2. The Cara Valley was 11 kilometers long, 300 meters wide at its narrowest, and flanked on both sides by mountain walls that rose steeply enough that exit from the road was not a tactical option, it was simply a different way of being stopped. The road itself was maintained in summer and essentially abandoned to the elements in winter, which meant that the surface was a compressed mixture of ice, packed snow, and frozen gravel that behaved differently at every third meter and could not be driven at speed by anything that wanted to remain on the road. Sergeant First Class Hewitt rode in the lead vehicle beside Private Callum Roth, who was 22 years old and had been driving in snow conditions for just over a year and handled the mountain roads with the grim, focused competence of someone who was afraid enough to be careful but experienced enough not to let the fear decide things. Hewitt watched the road ahead and the ridgelines and said nothing. In his experience, the time before contact was not a time for conversation, it was a time for watching. The radio traffic was minimal position checks, the steady confirmation that each vehicle remained behind the previous one, the technical communication of people doing a difficult job in silence. Outside, the storm intensified. The second front was accelerating. Above the valley, invisible through the cloud cover, the stars were absent. The only light was the convoy's own headlights, reflected back from the snow. Hewitt was thinking about transit time on schedule, perhaps 90 minutes from the valley's north end, when the drone operator's voice came through and changed everything. Raptor led, this is Sky Eye, contact, multiple heat signatures, north bearing, moving south. I'm counting a pause that lasted just long enough. 5 vehicles, mechanized. Lead element looks like an IFV. They are moving to block the valley exit. Hewitt was already keying his own channel. Time to contact? At current approach speeds, 10 to 12 minutes. Colonel, if they reach the exit point before you clear the valley, you'll be boxed. Briggs's voice came through with the controlled precision of a man who has received bad news before and knows how to process it without letting the processing slow the response. All vehicles halt. Hold current position. Maintain dark protocols. Then, on the command channel, Overwatch, do you have eyes on the contact? A brief silence. Then her voice unhurried, the voice of someone who had been watching this unfold and was simply confirming what she already knew. I have eyes. 5 vehicles, in column. IFV at the lead, 2 APC class behind it, 2 light command elements at the rear. They're moving slowly. The road conditions are the same for them as for you. I've been ranging for 3 minutes. Can you engage? I can. Give me 8 minutes. Briggs said, you have 5. Then I'll work faster. Hewitt looked at Roth in the driver's seat. Roth's hands were on the wheel and he was staring through the iced windshield with the fixed attention of someone who has been told to hold position and is holding position through an act of concentrated will. Hewitt said, very quietly, engine running. Gear ready. When she says move, we move. Roth nodded without speaking. He understood. In the vehicles behind, the soldiers waited in the particular compressed silence of people who are depending on someone they cannot see to do something they cannot do themselves. Overwatch position. Elevation, 2,340 meters 2 hours earlier. She had climbed the ridge alone, in darkness, departing the firebase 90 minutes before the convoy. The route had been identified from the topographic maps the previous afternoon and confirmed from satellite imagery she had reviewed with the intelligence officer, who had circled the Overwatch position in red and said, that's the only point with line of sight to the full valley. I know, she had said. That's why I'm climbing it. In a Category 3 weather event, at night, alone. Yes. The intelligence officer had looked at her for a moment. Then she had said, I'll have emergency extraction on standby. Thank you, Captain. They won't be needed. The climb had taken 1 hour and 57 minutes. The limestone was wet, and then frozen, and then wet again where it was sheltered from the direct wind, and the route went up a series of natural ledges that were passable in good conditions, and required care and patience in these ones. She moved without a headlamp. A light on the ridge would be visible from the valley, using her hands as much as her feet, reading the rock by touch, and by the pale ambient reflection of the snow around her. She fell twice on the middle section, where the ice glazed the rock completely. Both times she caught herself. Both times she continued. The position she had identified was a natural shelf of limestone, approximately 2 meters wide, overhanging the valley road by 400 feet of open air. Behind her, the rock face rose vertically. On 3 sides. Exposure. She drove 2 ice screws into a crack in the rock face and clipped a static line to her harness, not for psychological comfort, but because a gust that sent her off the shelf before she could fire would mean the convoy entered the valley without overwatch, and that was not acceptable. She packed the snow at the ledge's forward edge into a flat, firm platform and set the rifle bipod into it. The scope fogged with her breath, cleared, fogged again. She angled her face slightly away from the direct line of the wind and it stayed clear. She settled her weight, checked the safety line, and began ranging. The hostile formation was still 15 minutes out from the valley entrance when she first acquired it in the scope. She had time. She used the time the way she always used, waiting time, observing, recalculating, building a picture that was more complete with every minute that passed. Vehicle types, spacing, speed, the behavior of the drivers as indicated by how they handled curves. The crew of the IFV were professionals, the spacing was consistent, the turret was tracking, they were not overconfident. The APC drivers were less consistent. The command vehicles at the rear were hanging back, which meant their occupants were either cautious or important, or both. The range to the lead vehicle, 1,420 meters. Wind speed from the north at approximately 22 kilometers per hour, variable with gusts to 35. Temperature, -19 Celsius. Altitude, she was 340 meters above the valley floor, which affected air density and therefore bullet trajectory in ways that required correction. The cartridge she was using, a hand-loaded round with a 174 grain boat tail hollow point, built to her specific specifications by the armorer she had worked with for 6 years, would drop approximately 4 meters at this range under standard conditions. Nothing about tonight was standard. She made the corrections and made them again, checking her work the way a mathematician checks a proof, not because she didn't trust her first calculation, but because the margin for error at this range was the difference between a neutralized threat and a missed shot that told the hostile formation exactly where she was. Corporal Marsh's voice came through the earpiece. "Overwatch, convoy lead is asking for status." "Ranging," she said. A brief pause. Then, "They want to know, is the shot possible?" She watched a plume of wind-driven snow lift off the eastern ridge, read its direction and decay rate, integrated it into the calculation she was already running. "Tell them the shot is possible. Tell them to hold position and maintain dark protocols until I say otherwise." "Copy." The colonel also says, he says the range exceeds the effective envelope of the weapon platform. She looked down the scope at the lead IFV, 1,420 meters away in a mountain blizzard, and said nothing for 3 seconds. Then, "Tell the colonel the weapon platform respectfully disagrees with his assessment." She heard Marsh pass the message. She thought she heard Briggs's response, somewhere in the background static, but she was already attending to other things. The third gust had passed. The fourth was building. She would fire in the window between them. Range, 1,420 meters wind, variable visibility, near zero. There is a state that experienced shooters describe in various ways. Some call it the zone, some call it stillness, some call it simply being ready, and it is not precisely a state of calm. It is a state of total present tense attention, in which everything outside the immediate problem falls away, not because it has been suppressed, but because it has become genuinely irrelevant. The cold was irrelevant. The static in the earpiece was irrelevant. The question about the rifle that the colonel had asked 4 hours ago in a lit room was irrelevant. What was relevant was the wind, the distance, the slight cant of the rifle that she corrected by fractional muscle adjustment, the narrowness of the driver's viewport in the IFV's front armor, and the window between wind gusts that was coming and would close. She had been watching the wind flag pattern for 7 minutes. It moved in a cycle: north gust, channel deflection, valley updraft, with a lag between the third element and the next cycle's first that lasted, on average, 4 to 6 seconds. Within that 4 seconds, the crosswind dropped from unpredictable to merely unfavorable. It was enough. She adjusted the elevation turret 1 click up to compensate for the temperature effect on powder burn rate. She moved the windage 2 clicks right. The driver's viewport was a reinforced glass rectangle approximately 6 centimeters wide and 12 tall. Through the scope at 1,420 meters, it was the size of a grain of rice held at arm's length. The IFV was moving at roughly 12 kilometers per hour on the mountain road, which meant she had a brief, moving target at maximum effective range in a blizzard at night, and the shot had to enter through 6 centimeters of glass rather than strike the surrounding armor. Most shooters in the world, experienced, trained, decorated, would have assessed this shot as impossible. She had made harder shots. The third gust peaked and began to fade. She half exhaled, held the remaining breath. The wind flag dropped. She squeezed. The report of the rifle was a sharp, enormous crack that split the night air and was immediately consumed by the storm, swallowed before it could echo. The recoil came back straight and hard, not up. Straight, and she was already cycling the bolt before the weapon had finished its return stroke, muscle memory converting the bolt's movement into a single fluid motion. Rack, turn, push, ready. She kept the scope on the target. For 1.6 seconds, the IFV continued forward. Then it drifted. Not catastrophically, no explosion, no fire, just a slow, mechanical faltering, the vehicle losing its directed purpose and becoming a large, heavy object, moving by its own momentum. The front wheels turned slightly right. The vehicle coasted 15 feet and came to a soft stop against the snow shoulder. Headlights still on. Engine sound dropping through the registers of operation to something lower and then quieter and then gone. On the hostile command channel, which she was monitoring through a second receiver in her left ear, there was a brief silence followed by rapid speech that she couldn't parse at distance but whose character she recognized. Confusion. The particular quality of communication between people who expected something to be happening and are now managing the fact that it has stopped. She was already reading the second vehicle. In the convoy to the south, Colonel Briggs had his binoculars pressed to the windshield and was looking at the far end of the valley, where one set of headlights had gone from moving to stationary. "Vehicle stopped," said Whitmore beside him. "I see it. Could be mechanical, the cold, the road conditions." "No." Briggs lowered the binoculars. Something in his voice had changed. The certainty was still there, but underneath, it was a quality that had not been there before, something revising itself in real time. "That's not the cold." The radio crackled. "Colonel." Her voice, steady, almost conversational. "First vehicle is down. Adjusting for second target. Please hold position." A silence in the lead vehicle that had its own particular texture. Then Briggs said, very quietly, "Copy. Overwatch. 11 minutes. Over the valley." The second shot came 80 seconds after the first. She had shifted her bipod position 4 centimeters to the right. The second APC had moved out of its lane when the column stopped responding to the lead vehicle, and the geometry had changed. She also recalculated the wind, which had done exactly what she expected. The valley updraft created by the temperature differential had increased slightly as the storm's second front pushed air through the corridor from the north. The pocket of relative calm between gusts was shorter now, perhaps 3 seconds instead of 4. She would use 2 of them. The second APC's driver was less shielded than the IFV's. The viewport was larger, a design compromise that increased crew visibility at the cost of protection against exactly this kind of threat. She filed this observation away for future operational notes and fired. Second vehicle down. Same quiet cessation. The column was now leaderless, and confusion was visible in the behavior of the remaining vehicles. The third APC had stopped and both side doors had opened, soldiers spilling out with weapons raised, scanning the ridgelines for the source of fire. She went completely motionless. This was the danger point. Dismounted soldiers with thermal optics could potentially locate her position if she gave them a thermal signature breath vapor, the heat of the rifle's barrel, movement. She had addressed all three. Face mask deployed. The rifle barrel was coax cold from 2 hours in the mountain air and would not show meaningfully in thermal until she fired again. And she was completely still. She was the temperature of the rock beneath her. The soldiers swept the ridgeline for 90 seconds with systematic professionalism, which told her they were trained. They looked directly at her position twice. The second time, one of them paused. She stopped breathing. He moved on. She waited another 30 seconds, counting the time in the way she had learned, not by counting exactly, but by a kind of internal pulse that she had calibrated over years to be accurate to within 2 or 3 seconds. Then, she observed the soldiers returning to the APC and waited 20 more seconds. Then, she moved. The third shot was technically cleaner than the first two. The APC had moved slightly closer during the dismount and search sequence, bringing it to 1,390 meters, and the wind had settled into a temporary channel pattern that was more predictable than the open gusts. She put the shot through the front viewport at a slightly lower angle, aiming for the junction between driver and passenger seat where the armored partition began. The vehicle stopped with a sound she could hear faintly even at this distance, not an explosion, just the mechanical discontinuity of a running engine receiving a decisive interruption. 4 vehicles now. 3 down, 2 remaining. The light command vehicles at the rear had reversed and were attempting to turn on the mountain road, which was, from a tactical standpoint, the correct decision. Disengage, reassess, call for reinforcements. From a practical standpoint, on a road 2 meters wider than their vehicle in a blizzard, it was a process that involved a great deal of wheel spin and repositioning, and was not going quickly. One of them went off the shoulder. She watched it through the scope, the right rear wheels breaking through the snow crust and sinking into the soft fill beneath. The vehicle tilting slightly, the driver overcorrecting left and putting more weight on the high side. It wasn't going anywhere without a recovery vehicle. That left one. Overwatch. Briggs's voice in her ear, tighter now but controlled, the voice of someone who is absorbing new information and integrating it into a revised picture. Report. 3 vehicles neutralized, 1 immobilized in the road shoulder, 1 remaining command element, maneuvering. I have a shot available on the command vehicle. A pause. Authorize. Minimize personnel casualties. Engage the vehicle, not the crew. Understood. She observed the command vehicle through the scopes, still trying to execute the turn, rear wheels spinning on ice. The driver making decisions that were reasonable, individually and collectively counterproductive. Through the scope, she could see the driver's face briefly when the vehicle's own headlights swept across it during a turn. Young, pale, operating on adrenaline, not incompetent, just outmatched by the conditions and by something on the ridge that he didn't know was there. She aimed for the engine compartment, the most reliable disable without killing anyone who wasn't already committed to stopping her convoy. 4th shot. The command vehicle lurched, rolled 3 meters on inertia, and stopped. Steam began rising from the front end in the cold air coolant, or something adjacent. The engine was done. She cycled the bolt and held the position, watching. No vehicles moved. Soldiers were in the tree line. None were advancing. The tactical situation had resolved from active threat to contained disruption, and the contained disruption was staying contained. She said into the radio, "Convoy is clear to advance. All 5 vehicles down. No observed approach vectors from dismounted personnel. Road is open." A silence in the channel. Then Briggs. "Copy, Overwatch." Acknowledged. She heard something in the 2 syllables of acknowledged that had not been present in any of his earlier communications. Not gratitude, exactly. Not admission. Something closer to the sound a recalibration makes when it is happening. Lead vehicle, convoy moving. The encrypted data burst from command had been queued since before the convoy entered the valley, held in the satellite communication buffer by the terrain interference, and released the moment the convoy cleared a sufficient angle to the south. Captain Dana Whitmore's tablet received it first, a priority flagged file transfer that arrived with an access authorization flag she had not encountered before. Colonel. She said it in the way she had learned to say things that required his attention, no urgency in the word itself, all the urgency in the timing. I have the specialist file. It needed active mission status to release. He held out his hand without looking away from the windshield. She gave him the tablet. The file was 2 pages. The first page was a standard operational profile photograph, service designation, code assignment, current status. The second page was the summary record. He read both pages. He read them again. The file was classified 2 tiers above his standard access level, released on the basis of the mission authorization. Her operational name was at the top, Winter Phantom. The photograph showed the face he had seen in the briefing room, the same careful composure, the same quality of attention that he now understood had been operational, not personal. The record summary ran to a series of numbers and designations, the compressed notation of a career that had been conducted at a classification level where brevity was a form of protection. He read 51 confirmed long-range kills, 8 at ranges exceeding 1,400 meters, 3 of which were in the record as the longest confirmed shots under Category 3 or equivalent weather conditions in the operational history of the force. Primary weapon platform, modified bolt action, long barrel configuration, wood stock. He read that last part twice. Primary weapon platform for all 51 confirmed actions. The rifle he had called a museum piece. At the bottom of the page, in handwriting that had been scanned into the digital file old enough that the scan showed the faint pressure of the original pen, does not miss. Briggs set the tablet on his knee. Outside the windshield, the convoy was passing the lead IFV. Through the armored glass, he could see the vehicle's driver viewport 6 centimeters wide, reinforced, with a small, precise entry point in the upper right corner, 1,420 meters. In a blizzard, with a bolt-action rifle built in 1940. He looked at the shot. He looked at it, the way an engineer looks at a structure that should not be standing, and is standing not with disbelief, exactly, but with the careful attention of someone revising the limits of what they thought was possible. Hewitt, sir, when we reach the firebase and the cargo is secured, I want to speak with the Overwatch specialist, privately. Hewitt was quiet for a moment. Good privately, or bad privately? Good. Briggs was still looking at the stopped IFV as they passed it. Correction, privately. Hewitt accepted this without comment. In his experience, the most interesting thing about men like Colonel Briggs was not their authority that was expected, but the moments when they acknowledged the edges of it. The IFV activates 3 minutes before convoy clears. It was Whitmore who saw it. She had been watching the stopped vehicles on the drone feed thermal imagery overlaid on the topographic map when the heat signature on the IFV changed. The engine had been cold for 7 minutes. Now, something in the turret system was warming. Colonel. The flat, careful tone that meant do not wait to process this. The IFV. The turret system is active. Briggs looked. The IFV's main gun was a 30mm autocannon with a stabilized targeting system and a thermal imaging sight capable of acquiring targets through precipitation and darkness. It had been cold because the driver had been incapacitated and the vehicle had been leaderless. But the driver was not the gunner. The gunner had been in the turret the entire time. The turret was traversing. Not toward the road, not toward the retreating soldiers in the tree line. It was elevating, slowly, deliberately, the autocannon rising in its mount, the thermal sight sweeping upward with the patience of a system that does not hurry because it does not need to hurry. It was pointing at the ridge. Sniper position compromised. The drone operator's voice on the tactical channel, stripped of composure. IFV gunner has thermal acquisition on Overwatch position. Turret is traversing to firing solution. Her voice cut through the channel with a quality that preceded it, the way silence takes on a different quality a half second before something breaks it. I see it. The 30mm cannon at 400 meters would reach her position in 0.3 seconds from trigger pull. The thermal acquisition was already established. The gunner inside had been building the solution for perhaps 2 minutes, waiting, watching the ridge, locating through the thermal sight, the one piece of the mountain that was giving off slightly more heat than the limestone around it. She had been still for so long that the heat differential was minimal. But minimal was not zero. He had found her. The turret stopped traversing. It had found its firing solution. She had 1 shot, and perhaps 2 seconds. The 30mm autocannon's turret sight was a rectangular housing on the right side of the turret, approximately 20 centimeters wide, containing the primary thermal imaging aperture, a circular lens port, roughly 4 centimeters in diameter, designed to emit light and thermal radiation into the targeting system. It was not armored. Armor at that point would defeat its own purpose. It was the system's necessary opening, the single point of access to the electronics behind it. 400 meters. The turret had stopped. The solution was locked. The gunner's finger was on the trigger or was reaching for it. There was no way to know which, but the time remaining was the same either way, very little. She moved the crosshairs to the sight aperture. At 400 meters, the 4-centimeter circle was large and the scope larger than anything she had aimed at tonight. In a different register, this would have been an easier shot than the first. But there was nothing easy about the 2 seconds available and the knowledge of what happened if she missed. She did not miss. She had not, in 11 years of operational service, missed a shot that mattered. She did not breathe. She squeezed. The shot's report was simultaneous with a metallic clang from the IFV's turret that carried even over the wind the sound of a precision projectile entering a precision aperture and conducting several hundred foot-pounds of energy directly into the targeting electronics behind. The aperture closed with the round inside it. The thermal imaging system ceased to function. The firing solution, without eyes, was gone. The turret did not fire. In the radio, someone made a sound that was not a word. Then Hewitt's voice, very controlled. Overwatch. Threat status. She cycled the bolt, observed the turret, observed the IFV, counted 10 seconds. The turret did not move. Threat neutralized, she said. Convoy is clear. Move now. Firebase Langton, 3 hours after Valley Transit. The storm's second front arrived 40 minutes after the convoy cleared the valley, driving a new system of wind and snow across the mountain sector that would have made the road impassable for the following 18 hours. The timing was, as several soldiers observed independently, not comfortable to think about too closely. The cargo was secured in Firebase Langton's hardened storage facility within the hour of arrival. The vehicles were checked and staged. The soldiers dispersed to their assigned quarters, with the particular focused quietness of people who have been under sustained operational tension for an extended period and are now releasing it in the only form available, practical, activity, hot food, the careful maintenance of equipment that had just been depended on. She came down from the mountain 2 hours after the convoy reached the firebase. She had not come directly. She had walked the full upper perimeter of the ridge first, moving through the storm with the same steady patience she had applied to everything else in the last 12 hours, confirming that the hostile soldiers who had entered the tree line were continuing to move away from the valley and not consolidating for a second approach. It was not a dramatic reconnaissance. It was simply the completion of a job that was not finished until the route was clear. She came through the firebase's east gate with the rifle on her back and 4 inches of new snow caked into every seam of her parka. The gate guard, Corporal Thomas Greer, had heard the story 3 times in the last 2 hours and was still not entirely sure he believed all of it. He looked at her with an expression that wanted to be awe, but was still working through surprise. She walked to the gear room. She set her pack against the wall. She unzipped the parka and draped it over a bench. She took the rifle from her back and laid it on the cleaning table, and she began. This was not optional. This was not deferred for fatigue or for social convention or for the offer of food that one of the NCOs had already made twice. The rifle was clean because the rifle had been used, and a used rifle that was not cleaned was a rifle that would fail at the next use. And failure at the next use was not acceptable. She had cleaned this rifle in darkness, in rain, in the back of a moving vehicle, once in a decompression chamber before a diving operation. She had cleaned it when her hands were not fully functioning from cold. She cleaned it now with the same attention she had given it the first time, 10 years ago, when she had rebuilt it from the action up and first understood what it was capable of. The bolt came out first. Then the barrel assembly. She ran a solvent-soaked patch through the bore and held it to the light, checking the rifling. The lands and grooves were clean. The crown showed no damage from the night's shots. She ran a dry patch, then an oil patch, then rechecked. Colonel Briggs found her at the cleaning table 20 minutes after she had arrived. He came alone, without the junior officers and without ceremony. He sat down across from her at the table and he did not speak immediately, which was itself a form of respect. He was not a man who filled silences with words that didn't need to be there. She continued working. He said, I read the full file. Command released it when we went active. I know. 51 confirmed kills. 8 above 1,400 meters. Winter operations record. He was quiet for a moment. I should have read it before the operation. The classification level would have prevented that under normal circumstances. I'm aware. He folded his hands on the table in front of him, the posture of a man choosing precision over ease. That doesn't account for what I said in the briefing room, or the tone I used in the bay. She looked up from the rifle. He met her gaze with the direct, settled quality of someone who was not looking for absolution and was not offering an excuse, just stating a fact about himself that he had assessed and found wanting. I underestimated you based on the equipment, he said. That was sloppy. I don't make sloppy assessments, but I made that one. She set down the bore brush. She regarded him for a moment with the same calm, reading attention she applied to everything. It's a reasonable initial response, she said. The rifle looks exactly like what it is. People see old and they read limited. I read limited without looking past the surface. Yes. He absorbed this without flinching. Then I was wrong. Yes, she said again. Without heat, without satisfaction. She was not interested in his admission as a victory. She was interested in it as a calibration, a correction in a record that had been briefly inaccurate and was now accurate. That was all. She began reassembling the bolt assembly. I don't need a different rifle, Colonel. I need the rifle I can trust. In my experience, those aren't always the same thing, and which one you have determines everything that happens at 1,400 meters. Briggs looked at the rifle on the table between them, the walnut stock worn smooth at the grip, the reconditioned bolt turning in its seat with the precision of something understood and maintained. He was looking at it differently than he had looked at it 8 hours ago. This was apparent without being stated. The after-action report will reflect the complete record, he said. Your designation, your shots, the outcome. He paused. All of it. She picked up the stock and fitted the barrel assembly back into it. Thank you, Colonel, she said. Firebase Langton and beyond the days after. Stories from the field move with a speed that official reports cannot match, and they travel with a fidelity to emotional truth that more than compensates for their unreliability with specific facts. By the following morning, the broad outline of what had happened in the Cara Valley was known to everyone at Firebase Langton. By the evening of the second day, it had reached 3 other forward operating bases in the sector. By the end of the week, in the compressed, efficient way that military stories travel through the informal channels that exist alongside and beneath the formal ones, the account had reached people who had not been within 400 kilometers of the valley. The details shifted in transit. The range grew. The conditions worsened. The number of hostile vehicles fluctuated between 5 and 11 depending on the teller and the audience. The last shot, through the turret aperture, was described as impossible, with increasing frequency and decreasing exaggeration, until it arrived at a version that was, in its essentials, accurate. A shot through a 4-centimeter opening at 400 meters, with no margin for error and no second chance. And this version was the one that stuck, because this version required no embellishment to be extraordinary. Private Tyler Marsh told the story in the mess hall 3 days after the operation to a rotation of soldiers who had just arrived at the firebase. He told it plainly, the way he had experienced it, the briefing room, the rifle, the colonel's comment, the 4 shots, the turret that stopped moving. He had the cadence of someone who has recently been very afraid and is processing it through narrative. One of the new arrivals, Private First Class Connor Blake, young, skeptical in the specific way that soldiers who haven't been through anything serious yet are skeptical, said, a Woodstock bolt action in a blizzard at 1,400 meters. That's not a real story. Marsh looked at him. I was in the lead vehicle, Marsh said. I watched the IFV stop through the windshield. I was on the radio with her when she fired. I saw the turret. Blake considered this. And the rifle was actually an old Soviet bolt action with a wood stock. Yes, a rifle the colonel called a museum piece in front of the whole team 4 hours before it stopped a mechanized blocking force in a Category 3 blizzard. A silence in the mess hall. What happened to her? Marsh poured his coffee. She left before dawn on the second day. Nobody saw her go. Her gear was gone. The rifle was gone. and the only sign she'd been here was the cleaning kit she left on the table. He paused. Forgot it, probably, or didn't need it anymore. Where did she go? I don't know. I don't think anybody here knows. He drank his coffee. I heard the colonel requested her for his next rotation. I don't know if she said yes. Blake was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What was her name?" Marsh thought about this. Her operational name was Winter Phantom. The colonel read her file and he said, and this is the exact word he said, she was a legend. I don't know her real name. It wasn't in anything I had access to. The new soldiers sat with this for a moment. One more thing, Marsh said. He set his coffee down. The Colonel Briggs, who has been in the field for 28 years and does not say things he doesn't mean, he told the intelligence officer the next morning. I have seen a great many things in this work. I have never seen anything like what happened on that ridge. That's a direct quote. I was standing 3 feet away. Connor Blake looked at his own coffee. All right, he said quietly. Yeah, Marsh said. That was our reaction too. Unspecified location 6 weeks later. The room had no windows and was lit by fluorescent panels that cast the kind of light that doesn't favor anyone. The briefing officer was a woman Captain Meredith Sloan had not met before. Dark suit, careful posture, the particular composure of someone who spent their working life in buildings where composure was professionally maintained regardless of the content of the conversations happening inside them. A folder lay on the table between them. The briefing officer said, "The Cara Valley operation, after action designation from Colonel Nathan Briggs, submitted through command with a priority flag." She opened the folder. "He's formally requested your attachment to his next operational rotation, 9 weeks from today." Sloan looked at the folder without picking it up. "He also submitted a supplementary notation to your operational file," the briefing officer continued. "I'll read it directly." She lifted the page. "Recommend elevation of operational classification tier for this asset. Effective immediately. Field performance exceeded all documented parameters. Personal note for file. I was incorrect in my initial assessment of the weapon platform and of the operator. Both will not be underestimated again. The convoy and its cargo were preserved through the performance of an individual who was, in my professional judgment, operating at the highest level I have witnessed in 28 years of service. N. Briggs, Colonel." A silence between them that the fluorescent lights filled with their steady, indifferent hum. Sloan reached across the table and closed the folder with one hand. "Tell him yes," she said. She stood, lifted the rifle case from where it rested against the wall, and walked toward the door. At the threshold, she paused, not because she was reconsidering, but because she had the habit of checking the space behind her before leaving any room. The same way she checked a ridge before descending, the same way she cleared a scope before shooting. Everything was in order. She walked out. The door closed. Somewhere in a facility whose physical address was not publicly documented, a file updated. One entry added to a long and carefully maintained record. The language was the standardized notation of classified operations. Dry, precise, drained of drama. Cara Valley, winter transit operation. Contact engagement, 4 shots, 4 vehicles neutralized. Range, 400, 1,000, 420 meters. Conditions, Category 3 weather event. -19 Celsius, wind 22 kph variable. Weapon, modified bolt action, wood stock, long barrel. Outcome, convoy preserved, classified cargo secured, 0 friendly casualties, hostile blocking force eliminated. And at the bottom of the entry, carried forward from an older notation by whoever had been maintaining this record the longest, in the simple declarative that needed no elaboration and had never required any. Does not miss. The file closed. The system archived the entry alongside 50 others that looked, at a glance, much the same locations, dates, ranges, outcomes, but anyone who spent time with the record understood that they were not the same. The others described events. This one described a standard. The difference was not in the numbers. It was in the fact that in 11 years of operational service, the standard had never varied.